I mean, look, I think that was a tragedy. I found out about it, and the next day our family did everything we could to support at least the recovery efforts. Our heart goes out to those families who suffered here. I think we heard some of their stories, and it's sort of a travesty. I mean, I visited places like Flint, Michigan, forgotten cities in this country. I mean, Flint is in far worse shape than Davenport is, but it's the example of the kind of story you see in forgotten cities across this country, and housing costs are a big problem. And lack of affordable housing is a big problem. So how do we fix that? Well, same way I think I would fix a lot of the economic travails we face, increase the supply. So I'll talk about housing. We have burdensome land use restrictions that have had the unintended consequence of constraining the supply of new housing. Many people, even in, you look a little younger, but in your generation, I think have a desire to potentially buy smaller unit homes, but to still own that home. That doesn't exist at the unit of houses across the country because land use restrictions have said that this is the minimum plot that you have to buy in order to have a new house of a certain size. Well, not only does that constrain the supply of small size housing, that stops home builders from new home construction, period. That's a constraint on the supply of all housing. It's the laws of supply and demand. When you constrict the supply, the price goes up. And it reaches out of those, especially who want to afford smaller homes, who are then left holding the bag. So I would get rid of a lot of the regulations, and some of these are at the federal level or come down from federal agency minimum standards, but also some of these have to be driven by the states and localities as well. Eliminating the restrictions and the regulations that constrict the supply of housing, that's how we make housing more affordable in this country. And then that's a broader philosophy for me in general. Supply side driven problems across the country. Take the energy sector. Why are energy prices higher? We've restricted the supply of energy through restrictions on drilling, fracking, natural gas, which drives the baseload power generation. Natural gas and coal are the two sources of baseload power generation. We've constricted both. Is it any surprise electricity costs are going up, which is part of home ownership as a cost today. Natural gas, coal, nuclear energy, oil. You have a supply problem. Think about what small businesses face in finding new people to hire. That's actually one of the great challenges for many small businesses. Well, you have the government now paying people more money to stay at home than to go to work. It constricts the supply of labor. Think about a lot of the regulations on food producers. Increase the supply of food, that drives up the cost of food. So, as I said, I'm a business guy. Economics is more familiar and home territory to me. Increase the supply of everything that matters and that we're lacking. That brings down cost. It grows our economy. This isn't complicated. The country that put a man on the moon knows how to do this. For me, it's second nature. It's a matter of political will. And I do think it's going to take somebody who's able to cut through bureaucracy. That's what I've done my entire career. Cut through the bureaucracy of big pharma, built a multi-billion-dollar company developing medicines that pharma refused to develop. Cut through the bureaucracy of the ESG industry, built the top anti-ESG competitor to the likes of BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard in my time in the private sector. And so now I'm taking on the biggest bureaucracy of all, the bureaucracy of three-letter agencies in the federal government. But a lot of that isn't just philosophical. It's not just about the philosophy of three co-equal branches of government. That matters to me. But it's about stimulating our economy. That'll be the net effect of it as well. But I think part of the deeper issue, and there's a role for everyone to play here. I'm not one of these people who think the president has a magic wand to wave to solve all problems. Accountability, we all have accountability at our levels. At the state level, at the local level, at the municipal level, and even at the individual level outside of government. But I will say one thing is, when people can't aspire to own a home because land use restrictions have limited the construction of new small home ownership, then they're only relegated to options like the ones that they have in really, I think, subpar housing, public housing, apartments and otherwise, that they're then relegated to. So we have to get to that root cause. And I think that root cause isn't that we need Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to create artificial loans. We've seen what that looks like before. We need to eliminate the land use restrictions, a lot of these coming from the federal government as a trickle-down effect, some at the local government level, to allow for the new supply of housing, including small houses that have been restricted through saying that there's a minimum amount of acreage and a minimum size on a plot. This isn't like a hot culture war issue that makes the front pages of cable news, right? But I think it's going to take a president who understands the basic unit economics of what's actually happening to get to the root cause. Are there short-term solutions that we need in the meantime? Sure, absolutely, and a lot of those belong at the local level, but I want to get to the root cause. And I think this is a solvable problem, but it takes somebody who understands. And we see the same problem with baseload power generation, we see the same problem with food. We have, with the best of intentions, created regulations that have constricted the supply of everything that matters in the United States. So when I'm talking about reducing the size of the federal bureaucracy by 75%, it's not an academic concept. It's taking a wet blanket, shackling the rest of the US economy, and lifting that weighted blanket off. I think we can get back to 5% GDP growth in this country. And I think I'm the only candidate who can actually lead us there. And we talked about in the beginning national identity and pride. Well, you know what? People tend to be more proud of a country when they're making more money in that country and able to afford the things they actually need. So those two things go together for me. They're part and parcel of the same. Yeah, so I'm not an isolationist, to be clear. I just look at every international issue through the prism of what advances American interests. I think that we're closer to World War III than we've ever been in my lifetime. I think that avoiding World War III is a vital national interest. I think war should never be a preference, only a necessity. And I think the sole duty of a US policymaker, especially the US president, should be to the American citizens here in the homeland. I don't think those things should be controversial, but I think it's worth stating the premise. As a father, my sole duty is to my family. As a president, my sole duty is to the Americans who live here in the United States of America. All Americans. America first includes all Americans, not just the ones who agree with you. But that's the way I see my moral duty. So against that backdrop, my view is I apply a very high bar. I'm deeply skeptical of foreign aid to countries who have a lower national debt per capita than we do in this country. Now, if those countries need certain things that we have, there are other ways to get it to them. Selling it is an option. We don't sell it to everybody. We can sell it to allies. But I think the idea of just giving something to another country whose literal national debt per capita is less than ours, that doesn't make sense when we're $34 trillion into national debt. So I look at every prism through the interest of America, through the lens of American interests. In Ukraine, I mean, look, I think my view has, if I may say it, aged well over the course of the last 10 months, unfortunately. But that's the truth, is I would do a reasonable deal that gives greater certainty that Ukraine will actually get its sovereignty intact, which may not even be the track that you're on in a longer-term war of attrition. When the United States says they're going to be there, but eventually isn't going to be there. A reasonable deal that allows Ukraine to have its sovereignty intact. NATO will make a hard commitment that NATO won't admit Ukraine to NATO, but weaken the Russia-China alliance in return, require Putin to exit his military partnership with China. That reduces the risk of World War III. That advances American interests. And I think that is arguably, even for Ukraine, better than the track we're actually on. With respect to Israel, I stand absolutely for Israel's right to national self-defense. I said, we're living in a 1776 moment. I quote George Washington and Thomas Jefferson frequently on the campaign trail in this country. David Ben-Gurion was the George Washington of Israel. He was about 5 feet tall, but he was a mighty man, actually. I respect the heck out of him when you study the history of Israel. He said that Israel's founding principles, they never wanted to depend on the fleeting sympathies of the West. What are we seeing now, even in the course of 30 days? First we say, oh, we'll give U.S. aid, but now you're seeing Biden using that aid as handcuffs, to use those dollar bills to make paper handcuffs to tie what Israel can do. I think that's wrong. And the UN is trying to do the same thing. Israel has a right to its own national self-defense. But I think it's worse for Israel and worse for the United States when we muddy the waters, as opposed to keeping our prior commitments, which I favor. Always stand by our prior commitments. $3 to $3.8 billion per year is what we promised, and I would keep that intact. But the new specific aid for this war that muddies the waters, forces us to have accountability for the decisions Israel makes, which then forces us to play backseat driver and armchair quarterback, which is not good for Israel and not good for the United States. So I think it's a more deeply pro-Israel view than the rest of the Republican field, but it's different than the standard GOP talking points. And I think that when explained, both people who are in our pro-American movement, but people who also see the importance of standing for Israel understand it, doesn't translate itself into 30-second sound bites on cable news or on social media, but I'll tell you how I lead, is I'm grounded in first principles. Avoid World War III, stand for American interests, war's not a preference, only a necessity. And when you fail those tests, that's how you get to Iraq or Afghanistan. Thousands of people, your age, my age, that went and died in those foreign wars that didn't advance the American interests, thousands of Americans. 7 trillion of our national debt today owed to those two wars. So I will not repeat those mistakes. I'm not blaming those who came before. I'm learning from those who came before. But I think if we don't learn, we're destined to suffer even a worse fate in the future. So that's where I'm at.